Sorry, Holly, did you? Excellent. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Howard Horowitz. I live in New Rochelle, and I serve on the executive committee of the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration, which is our host for this important discussion. And this discussion is a part of Refugee Shabbat Weekend, organized by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, one of the oldest mutual aid societies in the United States, focused until late in the past century on Jewish immigration through the Russian immigration to the U.S., and now focused mostly on Africa, Central America, and the Middle East. So welcome everyone to this discussion. The topic today, as you all know, is the impact of COVID-19 on the immigrant and refugee community right here in Westchester County. We start off, of course, with the advantage this time of empathy. We all have been impacted, and we'll hear specifically about the immigrant community. And we'll also hear about important legislation, hopefully we can all support, regarding the fundamental right to counsel when faced with eviction from our homes. I'll be your moderator for today's conversation, and we are so honored today to be joined by Virginia Falkrod, the Executive Director of the Hudson Valley Justice Center, and by her colleague Jason Mays, the Center's Director of Litigation. Let's take a minute or two to ask Holly Fink to tell us all about the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration, why we're here, about our mission.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you everyone for being here this morning. I just want to give you a quick, tell you a little bit about the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration. We're bringing together immigration activists in the Westchester Jewish County to meet one another, share experiences, exchange resources, information, and contacts, and look for ways to support each other's work and influence immigration policy on a local, state, and national level. Even while most of us are already working with non-sectarian organizations, like I work with the organization Neighbors for Refugees, this work deserves to be applauded and supported. So we come together alongside partners such as HIAS, and we bring together Jewish leaders to strengthen the ties within our community, and at the same time establish an ongoing communication and action network. We are advocates with a common value system. And this weekend, we're so proud that over 30 congregations throughout Westchester are observing HIAS Refugee Shabbat, and that Right to Counsel joined us as part of our special observance. I'm going to drop a line in the chat box in a moment. I want you, if you have a moment, to help show your support for our local congressman on issues of the utmost importance for refugees and asylum seekers, like the right to fair housing. Please take a moment during this hour to fill it out and share with your friends. Thank you. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Holly. In a moment, we'll meet our panelists and begin our discussion. Holly, thank you for bringing up the chat, because while you're listening, we'd like you to put any questions you have for our panelists about the impact of COVID on immigrants and refugees, about the legislation in the chat box. We've set aside time at the end of our discussion to cover as many of your questions as we possibly can. So please put them in the chat. Also, we want you to know we're recording this conversation. We'll provide a link to it to everyone afterwards, and we will encourage you to share it with your friends, family, and colleagues in the justice peace movement here in Westchester County. On that note, let me welcome Virginia and Jason. I'm sure they'll be highlighted as they speak, and I'd like to ask each of them to take a few minutes to tell us all about themselves and about the Hudson Valley Justice Center, its mission, and their work at the center. So perhaps we could start with Virginia, the Executive Director, and go from there.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Howard, and thank you to the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration for putting this panel together, and for your commitment to improving the lives of immigrants As you've already heard, I'm Virginia Folkrod, the Executive Director here at the Hudson Valley Justice Center. The Hudson Valley Justice Center, just to give you the background, was created in 2014 with the mission to provide free civil legal services for poor and low income immigrants who cannot afford attorneys, and without regard to their immigration status. This was to address an unmet need in Westchester, specifically for immigrants who were facing housing court. If they lacked documentation, they couldn't have access to free legal services from organizations that had federal funding. So we specifically don't take federal funding so that we have a broader availability of services to people without regard to their immigration status. And we are also able to handle, as well as individual cases, class action and impact cases. We can certainly partner with other agencies to promote access to the American system of justice, whether that be through local policy or national policy and legislation in a way that other organizations cannot. We generally provide a broad range of services in several legal areas. The majority of our cases are here in Westchester. That's based on the fact that staffing and financially, it's easier to focus in on Westchester, but we can serve throughout the Hudson Valley. We generally serve people in housing, immigration, and family law are the majority of the areas that we work in. And we do a lot of partnering with community groups and other nonprofits to promote community education on legal rights through Know Your Rights presentations and various other outreach efforts. Just about me personally, I've been the executive director here for a little over 2 years. And prior to that, I've been working in Westchester's nonprofit legal community since graduating from Pace Law School in 2008. The majority of the focus of my practice has been in domestic violence, family law, and also in veterans work and immigration work. And I now find myself here at this wonderful organization. I'm happy to be here, and Jason, I'll pass it off to you.
Welcome, Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Jason Mays. First of all, thank you all for having us. We're really excited that people are taking an interest in this issue, and grateful to be able to share this information with you. I've been an attorney since around 2012. I started out at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley doing general practice, primarily for people with severe and persistent mental health issues. So I did everything, I did a lot of fair housing work, a lot of discrimination work. I also did some family law, Social Security hearings, basically a pretty wide variety of types of cases at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. And I joined Hudson Valley Justice Center with Virginia a couple of years ago, mainly because I was excited about the ability to do the kinds of things that federal funding doesn't allow legal services providers to do. So we could do legal advocacy, or we can work with undocumented people. There's a huge need for that right now. So again, thank you all for having us, and I'm excited to take part in this.
Thank you, Jason. If I could ask everyone to put themselves on mute, and then if you want, if for some reason want to make a
Howard, you're muted now.
Howard, I accidentally muted you because I was muting people.
I understand.
I apologize.
Fine. There might be other ulterior motives, but that's okay too. Again, Virginia and Jason, let's get right to the heart of the matter. What would you say is most important for us to know about the past, present, and predicted impact of this year of COVID on the immigrant community? In general, everywhere, but particularly here in Westchester, the focus of our attention right now.
Sure. And just even before I begin, it's obviously such a broad issue with overreaching impacts across the nation and the world. I'm going to do my best to sort of characterize how we see this issue for the clients that we touch, the community that we touch, and people here in Westchester, which is certainly going to be similar, if not exactly the same as the issues that everyone is facing. And it goes without saying that this past year has been a struggle for so many people. I would like to say all people, but you always have to just assume there might be somebody who isn't been impacted by the major emotional, social, and economic impacts that has touched, assume everyone in the nation. But truly the issue is the disproportionately negative impact of those impacts on the immigrant community, specifically the low-income community that we serve. The theme, I would say, for thinking about these issues is one of snowballing or compounding of issues, also been referred to as the domino effect when it comes to these sorts of issues in a low-income community. Once one issue occurs, it's very difficult to then climb out from underneath all the compounding issues that follow. And certainly nothing occurs in a vacuum, especially during this pandemic. And the people we serve are finding it very difficult to recover from these individual impacts. It really begins, I would say, with the loss of an unprecedented number of jobs, which of course created a snowball effect for the undocumented community and the low-income immigrant community in general. The simple fact is that the low-income community we serve, if they don't work, they don't get paid. These are not individuals who have access to some of the work from home opportunities that other people have been able to utilize during these times. And given the high cost of living in Westchester, the low wages many earned even prior to the pandemic resulted in a real lack of meaningful savings generally. We saw that as an issue prior to the pandemic when people would run into problems with, for example, being unable to pay their rent one month. That lack of meaningful savings, once these jobs are gone, any little bit of savings are quickly exhausted. And the result was many people in our community were completely unable to utilize relief programs and policies, such as the increased unemployment and stimulus checks. These were unavailable to those without documentation. And again, while these programs were broad and seemingly helping the masses, there were a significant number of people. The Migration Policy Institute estimates approximately 61,000 undocumented individuals in Westchester. So those are individuals who could not access these policies. Again, that figure, it's a difficult figure, as you can imagine, to capture because people are not eager to out their immigration status for obvious reasons. Certainly increased ICE enforcement and the overall state of the country in the last 4 years, as we can all imagine. Those numbers also don't account for the collateral impact on family members, documented or otherwise, who rely on those undocumented workers to support their families. The resulting debts from utilities and rent as that lack of income due to job loss. These are the compounding issues that we were seeing both across the country, but certainly here at home in Westchester. And another major result of this lack of employment, lack of funding that has to be mentioned is the staggering increase in food insecurity. Here in Westchester, many in the immigrant community, they're struggling to even put food on the table. And in the past year, estimates by Feeding Westchester, food insecurity has increased by more than 50%. People are relying on food banks more than ever, and many stand in line for hours, despite the weather, just to collect some staples for their families. And focusing in specifically on housing challenges, which is something that our agency deals with. It's important to note that even before the pandemic, there was a major shortage of affordable housing in Westchester County. Sort of a statistic that boggles my mind and that I love to share with people to help try to frame this issue is that the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that in the year 2020, a minimum wage earner in Westchester would have to work an average of 97 to 107 hours per week to afford a one-bedroom apartment. This lack of affordability is even more pronounced for those who lack employment authorization and are forced to work for less than minimum wage. This extreme cost burden of renting in Westchester forces many immigrants into room shares and overcrowded dwellings. And now with the pandemic, obviously this had health implications. This had major implications on immigrants' abilities to effectively homeschool their children. Childcare issues became compounded again by these multi-living family situations. And now with so many people still out of work or working reduced hours if they've been fortunate enough to go back to work, we have this issue of the rental arrears accumulating at alarming rates. So the housing struggles, again, the compounding issues for the families, the extended families, the children, education. These are all more of the snowballing impacts that we're seeing here in Westchester. And I'd say, Jason, if there's anything that I missed in terms of the broad stroke issues, I think that the major issue that we wanted to focus in on here today, and that we were hoping to increase visibility of, is the housing impact. Jason, is there anything that you think I missed?
No, I mean, I think the real issue is just that we know that the immigrant community is experiencing a huge loss of income. They're not going to be able to pay their rent. They're going to be subject to eviction proceedings soon, whenever this moratorium ends. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of eviction restrictions are in place.
Right. We can segue right into that. I wanted to ask you, but I think we've covered some of it, is the current state of relief programs in general that the immigrant community can, maybe more importantly, cannot, or even if they can, won't because of recent ICE enforcement type of regulations. So if you could enlighten us on what's the state of their access to relief, and of course, focus in ultimately on what's the status of the COVID eviction moratorium and how it affects this community.
Yes, so the biggest difference between the immigrant community and the documented community is that the immigrant community, or the undocumented immigrant community, I should clarify, doesn't have any way to replace their income when they lose their jobs, right? So people are eligible for unemployment benefits generally. We know that they've been getting enhanced unemployment benefits, but not undocumented residents. So if they were doing, we have a lot of clients who are doing things like cleaning houses, or they were involved in childcare, or if they were working at restaurants where they were getting paid in cash, and they have no way to replace their loss of income, they are completely dependent upon a lot of charitable organizations, food banks, places like that, just to put food on the table. Some of the rental assistance programs, like the federal emergency rental assistance program, that money can go to undocumented immigrants. But it really depends on how the state decides to distribute that to the various organizations that might be helping people and actually administering that. So that's good. The rent piece of it, the undocumented tenants are eligible for that. But so that's like some of the programs that can help people financially. I'll talk a little bit about the restrictions. We're not, the tenant activists don't use the word moratorium right now because there are evictions going forward. Certain types of evictions have been restricted. Other types of evictions are going forward. So right now, New York State, to its credit, did pass a couple of really impressive laws to address the COVID crisis. The first one was the Tenant Safe Harbor Act. That is a law that allows landlords to get money judgments against tenants who suffered a financial hardship during the COVID period, but not a possessory judgments against tenants who suffered a financial hardship during the COVID period. So what does that mean? That means the landlord can have a money judgment against the tenant who hasn't paid rent during this time, but can't use that judgment to actually lock a person out of the home. So that means whenever this period of time ends, the tenant will owe the landlord a huge amount of money, maybe $20,000, I'm just guessing on average. That judgment can be used to garnish wages. It can be used to seize bank accounts. It definitely has a bad impact on tenants, but the landlord won't be able to evict that tenant. Another law that was passed just at the end of last year was called the COVID Emergency Eviction and Foreclosure Prevention Act. And the way that affects low-income tenants is if the person is suffering a financial hardship or is at a special risk for a special health risk because of COVID, they can file a declaration with the court that will adjourn their case out until May 1st. Something to know about both of these laws, though, is that landlords have the ability to challenge them. So a tenant is going to say to the court, I don't have income, I lost income because of the COVID crisis, and therefore I shouldn't be evicted. The landlord's attorneys can say, we don't believe you, and we need you to prove it. And it's at that point that they really need an attorney, someone there to help them prove their case. They need the attorney to advise them that this is even an option. And they need someone to just kind of help understand this entire process. So those are the two the two laws that were passed that restricted evictions. Other types of evictions, though, are going forward. So if there's, like if there's a nuisance allegation or something like that, a landlord can actually evict a tenant right now. But I think those are the laws and programs that are available to all tenants right now.
And when does the moratorium expire?
So the
For
first,
each of them, like
the second law, the COVID Emergency Eviction and Foreclosure Prevention Act, that adjourns the cases out until May 1st. After that period of time, as of now, an eviction could go forward. The first law I mentioned, the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, which limits the landlord's remedies against the tenants. The way that law is written is that whenever all of the business restrictions end, the protections of that law will end. And that will depend on, the orders from the governor and just the general restrictions on public gathering and businesses opening and these kinds of things. So we don't know exactly.
And do either of you have any approximate stats on the size of the immigrant community, both documented and undocumented, that I'm sure are impacted by these hardships? In other words, how much of the immigrant community does have access to this relief and how much does not in general?
Well, I mean, I can try to answer that, but the one thing I would say, is that there's also a great deal of fear. I just wanted to add this from before. There's a great deal of fear to taking these benefits because of, I'm sure many have heard of the so-called public charge rule, which again, the immigration policies have been changing as rapidly as the housing policies have. But there's been an overall attempt to stifle the immigrant community's sense of safety and security in accessing benefits. So there, just to piggyback a little, there are families who have citizen children who would be more broadly eligible for benefits such as, assistance from the Department of Social Services, food stamps. But people fear taking advantage of those benefits because there may be some negative repercussion for them later, whether it be toward any attempt to naturalize as citizens. In terms of the specifics, I can pull those up for you, but I might want to drop them in the chat just because I want to make sure I characterize them correctly. These are going to be based on estimates, on census estimates. We obviously don't have the final census data. And again, we always run into this issue of trying to articulate the undocumented community, which is for many reasons very difficult to quantify. So I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is put that information into the chat, or perhaps if we're going to do a follow-up email with the links, I can include that information there.
Absolutely, but the answer was so informative, and you gave is so informative and moving. Just simply the vicious cycle that immigrants find themselves in when they want to naturalize, become legalized to be part of society. They actually take big risks of exposure and even attempting that. So what are our expectations of where they go? But in any case, to stay on topic. I think what happens, I think everybody on this session can imagine what happens when the statewide moratorium is lifted, worrying about all tenants and certainly the immigrant community. So in that context, tell us about the right to counsel legislation that the Hudson Valley Justice Center is advocating. A little bit about the principles behind right to counsel that we need to know about. It's not just a special case for immigrants. I think we all enjoy right to counsel in a certain way, and about why we actually need new legislation here in Westchester to make sure that people facing eviction have right to counsel.
I just wanted to say one more thing to speak to just what Virginia was saying, if I could. That public charge rule didn't actually have that much of an effect on tenants. On immigrants, in terms of what it prevented them from getting and the consequences it would have had. But it was very effective in making people afraid of taking any type of assistance, whether it was attorneys, which would not count against them in the public charge, under the public charge rule, or other emergency assistance. People are afraid to take any type of assistance, even when they're eligible, because of the fear that that law brought up in people. So it was a very effective in that regard, even though the legal consequences wouldn't have been as great as you might have thought. But anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. But moving on, yes, so the idea is for us that we all understand in America that there are certain legal decisions that might affect you that are so important that you should have an advocate and you should have an advisor letting you know what your options are and how the best way to handle the situation is, and just to make sure that the judge's decision, which is going to affect your life, is correct, right? We completely understand that when it comes to situations when our liberty is at stake. We're not going to put someone in jail without making sure that they have an attorney ensuring that the judge's decision is correct. In New York State, we have a law that gives a person an attorney if their child custody is at stake, because we're not going to take a person's child from them without giving them an advocate to make sure that that decision is correct, because that's so momentous. And the idea for us who are behind this Right to Counsel campaign is that we should think of evictions along those lines, because the consequences of evictions are horrible, right? It financially ruins people. It's traumatic for children. It puts people in a cycle of poverty. It's very hard to get out of. It's just, it's wrong, we think. It's also bad policy, and it's bad for our society because evictions are much more expensive than people think. When people are going into homeless shelter, that is a huge cost for our county. We could prevent that by providing people with attorneys. Another thing is that the reason we want our county to act is because we see this nationwide right to counsel movement, and a lot of cities are passing laws that are giving people these rights. Our county government has taken the position that they do support a right to counsel, but they want it to be a state law. Of course, if we could have a state law that gave people a right to counsel in housing and eviction proceedings, that would be great. But the particular law that the county is supporting right now, we don't think goes far enough. There is our bill that we've drafted, the Right to Counsel Coalition has drafted, pretty much mimics the bill that was passed in New York City. And that just basically gives everybody who's below a certain income level an attorney. And it gives people, there's like a higher tier where if you make a little bit more than the lowest income people, you would have advice. You get advice from an attorney. We'd like to see our county do that. The bill that the county supports right now is more of a 18B model, which may not mean much for people who don't know family court proceedings, but basically it would try to bring in a bunch of volunteer attorneys from the various bar associations, and that's a great, that's great, but we really believe that attorneys who know landlord-tenant law, who practice primarily in landlord-tenant law, would be much more effective at making sure that people's rights are protected, because people who practice in this kind of in landlord-tenant law, it's a very technical area of law. People who aren't experienced in it can easily make mistakes that can be pretty damaging for a low-income tenant. So that's why we think that our county should pass a law that mirrors the one that's in New York City. But there is a statewide right to counsel campaign that wants to pass a law like the one in New York City in New York State, and I can give you some contact information, but that's just now getting off the ground. It's an organization called Housing Court Must Change, and they had a meeting last week to really kind of start their campaign. They have a draft bill that a really amazing advocate from NYU, I believe, drafted, Andrew Scherer. He's the author of a prominent landlord-tenant law book. He's drafted this bill that we would love to see passed, but we'll see how that goes. But I'll give you the information about how to participate in the Westchester County Right to Counsel Coalition, and also the statewide coalition if people like that.
Virginia and Jason, could you just give us some highlights of, because there's nothing like successful outcomes to advocate for a certain policy or procedure. Can you highlight for us any impacts of this law in New York City that we'd expect to translate over in Westchester if the law is passed here, in terms of preventing homelessness or winning cases, or how have the tenants fared under this, and the landlords fared under this new law?
There was a notable reduction in eviction filings in New York City after this law was passed, but the way that the data isn't really that extensive right now, because the way that law was passed, it's being rolled in through various zip codes. So basically, they looked at some of the zip codes that where this program was effective, and they noticed, I think it was like a 17 to 20% drop in eviction filings during these, after this program was put in place. And basically what that means is landlords were thinking twice about filing eviction proceedings because they knew that the tenants were going to have attorneys. And that probably means that maybe those cases didn't have that much merit to them. And, one thing I think I should mention is that I think people often think that eviction proceedings are all about rent. People get evicted when they can't pay rent, right? That happens sometimes. Probably that's the majority of cases. But there are other types of proceedings in which people are losing valuable tenancies that's not about rent. So if your housing is protected by the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, if your housing is subsidized by a low-income housing tax credit, if the tenant is receiving some type of Section 8 subsidy or something like that, if that person gets evicted, they're losing a source of affordable housing that could keep them housed for a long time. That could be because they suffered some kind of financial hardship, but it could also be because the landlord has other ideas for the property. The landlord maybe there's some kind of like personal dispute between the landlord and the tenant that might lead to an eviction, even though the tenant might have a defense to that. And when you see people pushed out of those types of homes, then they lose a stable source of housing, an affordable source of housing, and that is, in addition to just being wrong for that tenant, is also increases the cost on other agencies if that person is going to a homeless shelter, or if that person has to rely on other subsidies from other organizations. We need to really think, we need to make sure we're preventing those types of evictions.
Just to be clear, though, that this none of this legislation interferes with the landlord's right to their day in court. This is just provides rights for the tenant for their day in court.
That's right. It gives them, it gives them advice about their rights. Right. That's it. It's not a landlord's attorney can stop a wrongful eviction. A landlord's attorney, a tenant's attorney can stop a wrongful eviction. We can't really stop a rightful eviction. So if the landlord has the right under the law to evict a tenant, we're not going to be able to stop that. Tenants' attorneys can do things like make sure that there aren't fees that are included in a judgment against the tenant that shouldn't be on there. So we often see landlords include late fees, parking fees, or other attorney's fees, or just extraneous fees that a tenant shouldn't be evicted for not paying, right? If you don't pay your rent, you get evicted, but if you don't pay your parking, you can't get, you shouldn't be evicted for that. And if those charges are included in a judgment against the tenant, then effectively what that means is that person would have to pay their parking fees in order to stay in their home. Attorneys can separate out those fees and make sure that that they aren't getting a judgment against them for something that shouldn't be on there. Also, attorneys can make sure that landlords are not charging tenants rent when they're not entitled to it, and that could happen if the conditions in the apartment have deteriorated to such an extent that the tenant is entitled to an abatement. So in all landlord-tenant contracts, leases, implied or written in New York State, there is an implied warranty of habitability. And if your apartment conditions deteriorate to such an extent that it threatens that warranty of habitability, a tenant might not have to pay the full rent. We have to make sure that the full judgment isn't entered against that tenant, because when that tenant goes to places like Catholic Charities or DSS or something like that to try to get paid, we have to make sure that that landlord isn't getting paid the full rate when they're not entitled to it. And it takes an attorney to be in court to make sure that that judgment is correct. If we're just paying the tenant's rent without an attorney, we're overpaying. We're over, you know, like if our support structures like Catholic Charities, like DSS, like the United Way and the various charitable organizations that are trying to keep people in their home, if we don't couple attorneys with that, we're just paying we're paying landlords that might not be entitled to it. Sometimes we're paying slumlords to, you know, keep getting their unearned income when they're not keeping up the housing stock.
Virginia,
Sorry. If I could just piggyback on what Jason's saying. Jason very appropriately gave you the legal reasons for the attorney, but then there's also the unspoken reason, which is that lawyers work better with other lawyers. Lawyers for landlords don't approach tenants generally in the same way they're going to approach the case once we're on the case, even if there isn't a basis to, to have an eviction proceeding thrown out because it's an illegal eviction. Even if there is merit to the eviction case, just by having a lawyer on the case, we're able sometimes to speak with the other side and get more time to move and even waive judgments, because we're able to look the attorney in the face and say, listen, you might be entitled to a $2,000 judgment, but this is somebody who is, people often say judgment proof. Nobody's judgment proof, but you can certainly be collection proof, right? So you can get a judgment against this individual, but you're going to spend a lot of time and effort and money chasing after them. You're not going to get the money. Why don't we just agree they'll leave, by the end of the month and just wipe the judgment? And landlords will work with us on that. And that's an unspoken remedy that's not necessarily a legal remedy, but it's something that we can achieve for tenants. And I think, Jason may mention this, and I know it's hard to put facts and figures on the cases in New York City, but as an unrepresented tenant in Westchester, you have minutes in the courtroom in front of the judge. Minutes to state your case, explain what's going on, ask for help, relief. And on the other side, you have a lawyer generally representing the landlord. So even just having an attorney involved can slow things down, give us an opportunity to find those community support services that can pay the rents, or simply give the tenant time to come up with resolutions. As we're correcting ledgers and looking at the legality of what's going on, sometimes tenants are able to find solutions for their families that allow them to transition safely into other housing. So it's not necessarily that we have taken a legal route, but it's the ability to negotiate and work with the other side to come up with safe remedies for families.
And if I could just say, if we can partner with the other organizations that we often partner with, and we can slow down a proceeding until we can get the money from those other people in those situations where the tenant has fallen behind in rent, that gets the landlord money, right? A lot of times we end up getting the landlords paid, whereas if we weren't involved, the tenant would be evicted and the landlord would have a money judgment against the person with no money, and they can't use that to pay their mortgage, if it's a small landlord. So it can be mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I want to move on to the topic of how we can all get involved in moving this or advocating for this legislation. Before I do, though, I think the benefit to the tenant, and certainly we can imagine that the immigrant community is more likely to be one of these, is very likely to be one of these tenants. That benefit is clear. I think we all sympathize. What's in it for us, though? I understand from your papers that there's a study that you want funded, or that you already know about, that us taxpayers actually benefit from this kind of representation, and it's not actually a net cost, but actually a net gain. Can you briefly, Virginia, address that?
Actually, I'm gonna ask Jason to address that, because I know he may be planning to use some portions of that presentation. Were you going to share those with the group, Jason? Are those the slides you were going to show?
Well, I think we've pretty much covered the information, but on that point, that so since we started advocating for the county program, obviously, anytime we approach the county, and this is a legitimate question, they ask, well, how much is that going to cost? Because if hiring attorneys could be potentially very expensive. Well, we've asked the county, and they have actually agreed to fund a study, the study that was used in New York City, to find out what the cost benefit analysis of this really would be. Because we've mentioned ways in which attorneys being involved can avoid some fees. So if the attorneys are involved and they're reducing the judgment by pointing out that maybe there are conditions in the apartment, or maybe there are fees included in the judgment that shouldn't be paid, we're reducing the amount of money that we as a county have to pay to keep people in their homes. And if we're avoiding evictions, we're avoiding people staying in homeless shelters, which can cost as much as, over the course of the year, to keep a homeless shelter full, it's as much as $40,000, right? To keep someone in that shelter for a year. So there are significant offsets, cost offsets. Also, if attorneys are involved in negotiating with landlords, where I think Virginia mentioned before, our office received some CARES Act, and we said, look, we have some money, we can pay landlords to try to keep people in their homes, but we can't pay everyone's rent. So we're going to try to spread it around and help as many people as possible. So we negotiated with the landlords, and we saved about 13% on average from each of the tenancy that we saved. So if landlords can be involved, I'm sorry, if attorneys can be involved in both negotiating and making sure that illegitimate charges aren't included on the ledgers, it could really potentially save us money. But we need a third party to really look at that and decide what offsets we could really realistically count on. And in the city, they decided that would actually save them money. There's a good chance that it could save us money as a county if we did this, but we hope that study will get off the ground soon. The county did put money in this year's budget to fund that. So, yes, there's a chance that this wouldn't cost us very much. Obviously, as a matter of justice, we think it's right and that we should do it even if it costs us something, but there's a chance that it wouldn't really cost us very much.
Yeah, so just such an important point, because all these things, when we think about it as taxpayers and voters, has to be sustainable in some ways, and makes a lot of sense. But before we run out of time, I don't want you and us to lose this opportunity to tell people how to get involved, how they can participate. I understand you might have some things to put in the chat, or already have, how people can get involved in advocating for this legislation, should they be so inclined.
Yes, so we have a website that we've set up that makes it really easy for a person to identify their legislator, and they can cut and paste an email and use that as a template to contact their legislator. Of course, they can adjust that and change their message however they like. But given given where the county is right now, and the county's position that this should be a a state wi we do really need to pressure our legislators and let them know that this is really something that we think needs to happen. So I'm going to put that website here in the chat right now. I'm having some trouble, but I'm going to do it. Okay, here we go. So if you go to that website there, that will make it easier for you to contact your legislator and let them know how important this is to you. One thing if I could just say real quick, we're in a situation where we know so many people have lost income and have found themselves in a position where don't think they would ever have been, right? A lot of people have gone from having normal, like their entire life, they've had jobs, they've been able to pay their bills. Suddenly everything has changed, and we are, as a society, it's easier for us to say that could be me. That I could be, there before the grace of God go I, that kind of thing. But I have to say, almost all of my clients are in arrears because of something that's outside of their control. We're suffering because of this thing that is outside of their control. 90% of my clients suffered some kind of, like they lost their job, or they, it's easier for us to sympathize with people who are in this position if it's hurting everybody. But if we really think about it, most people that are, that can't pay their rent are suffering some kind of financial hardship because of something that's outside of their control. So maybe this gives us an opportunity to think about that. I don't know. That's just something that occurs to me whenever we are on this subject.
Excellent. And is that
we've had one event so far, a socially distanced event. It's been a little cold for outdoor socially distanced events, but the coalition, there will be additional events upcoming to participate in to get the word out about Right to Counsel. Jason, I believe there's one in March as Catholic Charities. I may have the date wrong or the month wrong. I just know there are some upcoming events to further spread the word, and there's ability to become involved in those events as well.
Yeah, actually, now that I'm thinking of it, I'm going to put in an email address that you can email and get updates about future events. I think that's on the website, that link that I gave you, but if it's not, you can email this.
And please keep WJCI informed of upcoming events and initiatives. Does this link you provided also provide a link to, I believe there was a petition going around that people could sign that's going to be submitted to the Board of Legislation?
We set up that petition before this new website was set up. With this website, we can track all of the things, all of the emails that go out. So, it's a little duplicative, but I will put if people go through this website that's on the Call on Me, that's linked up with the Call on Me website, we'll be able to track all that, and it'll be as if we have a petition. But
finally, before we turn to Q&A from the audience, is there a bill proposed? Is this on the legislative agenda, and what is the kind of schedule that it's on?
We've offered our bill to the legislators. No one has taken it up. No one has sponsored it. So there are people who are very supportive. Some legislators are very supportive, others less so. So we don't have a bill that's sponsored that you can refer to yet.
All right, so you'll let us know about that.
Yes.
As well. So Holly, will you help me with the Q&A? Have you been able to?
I will be happy to, yes.
To pose them to our panelists, and we'll cover as many as we can.
Our first question is from Elizabeth Lampert. I work as a community support specialist, helping those who are at home due to COVID exposure. What do you recommend as a resource for people who are at home in quarantine and isolation, and so they can't work and can't pay their rent? Many of them don't work in businesses where they are eligible for paid sick leave.
Well, I'll start, and then Jason will make sure I got he'll back clean up because he's my housing expert. But these are exactly the people that should be trying to utilize the current, the current ability, the hardship declaration, to tell the court exactly where they stand if they receive eviction papers. Somewhat of a glimmer of good news. Well, we do have this concern that putting money towards funding arrears programs without funding attorneys, that's something that's of great concern to Jason and I. However, you can't ignore that the good news is there are arrears funds out there. So for anyone who's facing these situations, I would encourage them to do a legal intake, either with our agency. As we've stated before, we work with immigrants specifically. We can work with undocumented immigrants. Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, another major provider in the area, can help people who are citizens who have housing issues, but getting assistance with understanding their rights under the current eviction restrictions, and also to get them connected with any potential sources to pay rental arrears to try to prevent judgments whenever these restrictions are lifted. I mean, Jason, is there anything else you would recommend?
Well, I mean, first place people should go is the Department of Social Services. Most of the other charities are going to need a denial letter from the Department of Social Services, but after that, you should go to Catholic Charities, United Way. The Westchester County has an informal eviction prevention network, and there's a unified form that people can complete to apply for assistance from a wide variety of nonprofits in the area. And my office has those forms, and we can pass it along to tenants, and they can submit to a large number of potential sources of assistance that way.
I assume that link that you put in would provide contact information to get in touch with the center for resources. Is that true?
People should go through our website.
Yeah.
That's what I was
the
saying.
link, the
We
website.
either, I don't know if we were going to put that in the chat or were we going to follow up with an email? I know we had talked about putting the same links. I can either put
Okay,
that a
great.
link to our website in the chat, or I could, whichever.
If it doesn't have to be an either or, if we can put it in the chat and
Do both.
send it an email,
Perfect.
we'll definitely follow up, and repetition is a good thing.
I'm gonna copy the chat box, so put in whatever you like and I'll pick it all up. The next question is if you could speak to from Alan, who's actually one of our EC members on WJCI. Can you speak to the cost to the county of A, the law that the county executive once passed, and B, the law that WJIC once passed, which I understand mirrors a law passed in New York City?
Right. So we can't really talk about the cost without doing that cost benefit analysis to know what kind of offsets we would have for the bill that we're proposing. The bill that the county is supporting, the statewide bill, tries to draw in a lot of pro bono attorneys and use the 18B model to pay some attorneys in some instances. So which one is more cost effective is hard for me to say. I don't really know, to be honest. I think that the bill that we're proposing would be more effective from a legal perspective because it would have, housing specialists representing tenants. But I can't say exactly which one would be more. I assume that the bill that the county supports for the statewide program right now would probably be cheaper, but it may be because it's not as good.
Can I, this is Alan. I'd just like to understand, I very much support what you want to do. I think the issue from the county's perspective might very well be, do they spend money if they think that there is a net cost to the county and to the county government in particular, then they need to know whether or not there's offsetting benefits to the taxpayers. And secondly, whether they can get that money somewhere else or need to take it away from other programs. So for instance, just as an example, if they put in $1 million into this, then that $1 million presumably won't go to their arts program or to their public support program or whatever. So, it is a zero-sum game. They're not going to raise taxes in order to do this, presumably, certainly in the current climate. So I think it's totally understandable that they want to get an assessment. I guess the question is, how long will that take? And does that necessarily mean there won't be help for at least another fiscal year before that assessment can be done? Because that's probably why some of the county legislators are reluctant to support this, because they don't see how much it's going to cost.
Right, absolutely. You're right, and that's understandable. So the proposal that we got, that we used to make our request for the study, it was like $50,000, and it would take 6 months to complete. And Stout was the global advisory firm that would complete that. So that would take about 6 months for us to know from a third party who's disinterested, like what we think the real cost of this thing would be. So we hope that they get started on that, so we would know. In the short term, we know that.
And sorry, that's been approved, right, Jason? So, but have you received the money yet, or are you able to start that 6 months? Not yet.
No, we haven't. They haven't started that yet. I mean, we've requested a meeting with the county executive, and they said that they will meet with us, but they, obviously they're trying to do the vaccine rollout and these kinds of things, which is fair enough. So we're going to have a meeting with them and hopefully we'll get something started soon. I think that'll answer that question, which is an important question. You're right. It does need to be answered. We need to know how much this would cost. In the short term, we know that there is this treasury money that's eviction that's to be used for funding, and 10% of the federal treasury money can be used for administrative fees. And so there's a chance that some of that could be used to fund attorneys, maybe not to fund, a right to counsel program, but it could expand legal services and could provide people with more attorneys, not universal attorneys, but that could be a way we could go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Underscores the urgency versus the timeline.
Sorry, we have one more question from another WJCI member, Joan Cass. What about educational outreach to local immigrant groups like El Centro and White Plains? I know you guys work very closely with Community Resource Center. Janet was actually in the meeting earlier. I was so happy to see her. So yeah, tell us about some of the local organizations you work with.
So we have a lot of strong partnerships. There's a lot of excellent organizations in Westchester that serve the immigrant community. We've done a lot of work with CRC, the Community Resource Center down in Mamaroneck. And we do a lot of partnering with Neighbors Link, which is primarily they work out of Mount Kisco. We do a lot of partnering with Catholic Charities, but the bottom line is we're happy to partner with anybody that wants to get the word out. We've done combined presentations. We've done them at Purchase College, we've done them at food banks. Anyone who will listen to us, we're happy to give presentations to. And then we have actually done work with El Centro Hispano, and I believe, I may be wrong, I believe they changed their name. So I no, okay. So I was just making sure, but they do a lot of really great work. We work with them on the immigration side with some of our presentations, but we'd be more than happy to do a housing presentation with them as well. Like I said, and if any of you work with groups that you feel would benefit from knowing more about the housing laws and how tenant protections, tenant responsibilities, how they impact the community, we're always happy to provide that education.
Mm-hmm. Well, hi, this is Joan, and I would just urge you to go back to El Centro because I've attended meetings there, and they've able to bring 500 people to a meeting. So I'm sure you know Isabel Villar, and I will say a word about it as well to them.
Thank you. It's really essential for us to be able to work with people, organizations who have trust in the communities because of the fear that we were talking about before. People oftentimes, I've met with people who I believe had a good defense to a proceeding, and they have decided that they would just rather leave than assert their rights in court. And I'm not, I'm not judging anybody for that. I mean, I can understand why people would be afraid, but it really is essential for us to work with people who have trust in the community, and so that we're not just strangers walking up to people who are not always understandably who are skeptical of assistance.
Thank you so much, Howard. You can close up. Thank you.
Okay, I will. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Jason and Virginia for sharing this important initiative. Again, the particular issue is urgent and important and difficult, considering costs, considering the fears in the community, etc. And it also broadens our perspective that it's not just about borders, it's about life here in the United States and rights and privileges and mutual aid. And on that note, I just want to throw in answer back to Elizabeth's question that to the extent that the family she's familiar with have food insecurity and other issues, the local food banks have been very effective and very well organized during this COVID and very safe. And very oriented towards the undocumented, so it's safe all around. And there is an organization called Hudson Valley Mutual Aid, which is another resource that people can tap into. So on that note, I want to close and thank all of you for being here. And if I could repeat sort of a bottom line takeaway for me is that no one in Westchester County, the county we live in and love, should face eviction or other legal action without proper representation. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day. Please stay involved.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Howard.
Well, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Virginia.
And thank you, Rena.
Presentation.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you so much, Rena.
Thank you, Rena.